Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the March installment of the Georgetown Center's Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom webinar. Jennifer Fritchie, how are you? So nice to see
Good.
you again.
Nice to see you, Carolyn. And I have my sign.
Oh, we are off to a good start. We are incredibly happy to be joined by two experts, Roz Layton, who is with Strand Consult and is probably the one who is furthest away from us right now, joining us from Denmark. And then we have Michael Santorelli, who's the director of the Advanced Communications Law program at New York Law School. Michael and Roz, thank you both very, very much for joining us. The
Great to
topic
be
for
here.
today, because we have to come up with some sort of provocative title to get people to pay attention in their inbox, is broadband subsidy programs under the Trump administration here today, gone tomorrow? And I put that as a question mark. So I think, as everybody knows, Jen, we've got an oral argument going on at the Supreme Court. Roz, I know were listening to it before we went live. Um, I thought maybe we would kick off our discussion with you, given what the Supremes are going to be hearing today, and talk a little bit about the research that you have published in terms of how we might think about expanding the base and putting the USF fund in particular on a more sustainable financial footing. So, Roz, first and foremost, if you could, for folks that are with us who might not be as up to speed on USF, can you just remind us what is ginned up in today's oral argument?
Yes, well, again, thank you for the lovely invitation. Great to be joined by Michael, and nice to meet you, Jennifer. This is an exciting day, and as we're speaking, there are oral arguments in the cases of the FCC versus Consumer Research, and then the Schools and Libraries Coalition, the consolidated case. And it is exciting in the sense that for those of the people who are studying constitutional law or administrative law, a lot of these kind of typical civics questions are up to date. They're up in this case. What is the power of Congress to delegate certain activities? And were they right in giving the FCC the particular set of authorities around the Universal Service Fund? So when I jumped over to you, they were still on the side of the FCC, and Paul Clement, who, as people might know, he argued the Looper Bright case and won. He's actually arguing in favor of the government and the constitutionality of USF at the FCC. So it's a very exciting case. There's lots of briefs on both sides, particularly 30 congressional lawmakers of both parties in both houses of Congress, talking about the importance of the program, its constitutionality, all of the things that they can do to provide oversight. So that was absolutely brought up in the case. As usual, when you listen to these kind of oral arguments, you can't always extract what the decision will be from what they say. The judges will purposely give tough questions to kind of put the lawyers through their paces, and to see, they're testing their own thoughts on it. But I think a lot of good points came up. And what was the complaint in the first place? Consumer Research brought this case. They brought a number of cases against U.S. agencies at the time, where they were basically saying this is, it's too much government overreach. And I actually don't think they expected it to come this far. But in any event, there's a complaint that, that the USF is an unlawful tax, that for example, if you're getting voice services, every dollar of the voice service gets an assessment of 38 cents. And that is what we use to fund broadband programs, a set of broadband programs. And that is unfair, it's unlawful. And
But it's
so,
also,
that's
Roz, it's also it's a policy that doesn't take into account that this is an ever diminishing pot of money upon which to assess, right? I mean, long gone are the days from a technology perspective that there is such a thing as long distance, right? So, I mean, we know that the USF system has been, broken, as it were, I think is how it's described inside the Beltway. Obviously, some of these constitutional issues incredibly important, not just for administrative law, but specifically with respect to USF. And while it is hard to maybe guess where the court may land when we see their decision in a couple of months, I guess my question, Roz, to both you, also to Michael, and Jen, to you, and that is, what if the Supremes say, you know what, we find this to be a violation of the non-delegation doctrine? And I assume that it gets sent back to the FCC, or are we looking at it immediately jumps over to Congress and we've got to do something legislatively. I trying to understand what the impact is of a decision to find that these elements are in fact not okay. And then separately, what if they are upheld? What then? So have at it.
Well, let me, that question came up in the oral arguments, and I think the first point, and the justices pointed out, there are many people who rely on this program. I mean, there's about 100 million people a year who will connect to the internet through some kind of USF program. And, that was emphasized. However, Congress could, if in fact it was struck down, Congress could fix it. In fact, they have been working on fixing it. There's actually a bill, the Mullen-Kelly bill, that was proposed in the last Congress, which is a complete universal service reform with contribution reform, distribution reform, all of the elements. And there is a USF working group, bipartisan and bicameral, which has also drafted legislation. So this isn't a problem for Congress to fix if it was struck down. I think it's highly unlikely to be struck down. And I actually think, from what I heard today, I didn't hear the other side, but it sounded like that, the FCC would be confirmed that they had the right point of view.
Jen, I'm kind of curious what the street is thinking about on this one, or are they focused on it? I would assume so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're focused on it enough, to be honest, but I think anytime the street hears uncertainty and then equates that with 100% or 90+% margin revenue, they get nervous. I mean, we haven't, because of the consolidation the industry has seen, there hasn't been any more pure play, like certainly AT&T and Verizon get USF, but what percent of their revenue? It's, that doesn't seem like it. But the concern would be for some of the smaller players who are still out there. No question.
Michael, any views on who this hurts, helps, depending on how it goes, or just from a legal perspective, any thoughts?
Well, I'll just mention, and just to tie in the other topic here, BEAD, is that presumably some of the BEAD awardees would also look to USF funding going forward to sustain their expansions in certain territories. So, it's part of the economics for some of these grantees. BEAD is just a one-off subsidy to build the networks, and there's nothing out there for operating. And presumably that's where USF would come in for some, or maybe all the players building out in certain areas. So, yeah, I think that's a angle that hasn't been looked at a lot. Just that, there's so many tie-ins and connected to USF. So if that one domino fell, I think there would be a lot more that some people might not be thinking about.
Really good point. Roz, I wanted to circle back and talk a little bit about the research that you have published and the analysis that goes to the funding, and how one might think about expanding. Well, let me backtrack. As an attorney, let me play an economist and quote our professor, John Mayo, who will remind you that if you are trying to do something very efficiently, you focus it very, very tightly on the problem you're trying to solve, and you spread the cost over the largest number of folks or entities. And I'm curious if you could share with us, your thinking on that very specific issue, which is how do we put USF on a more sustainable financial footing going forward?
Great. Well, and let me just make one distinction before I talk about that. The funding the funding today is unsustainable is not the constitutionality issue at all. That's a completely separate issue. And, I think as we all know, when this program was put in place, there was really no internet as we think of today. And today our digital economy is $5 trillion. It was in no one's mind at that time. And many people still think that the internet works like the telephone network, that it's you call me and I call you, and it's sustainable. What people don't understand is when you build a network, there are ongoing costs. And what, the research that I have done shows that for USF households and businesses in the USF area, just that set of entities, they're driving over $200 billion a year to what we'd call big tech. Apple, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, TikTok, that there is a set of beneficiaries that are benefiting enormously from this program, and yet they pay literally zero to it, and they don't want any part of it. So we have a real challenge in that we have essentially seen low-income seniors who are on fixed income with telephones are subsidizing a program to provide broadband access, which disproportionately benefits our largest technology companies in America that are multi-trillion-dollar entities. So that is something that is quite perverse. That's not what's being debated today. But when you think about having a sustainable program and the importance of broadband to our society, to our economy, it's absolutely correct. Brendan Carr has talked about since 2021 ending big tech's free ride on the USF.
So let me ask you this. How could you just share a little more details on how would a system like this work so that because very often a pushback you'll hear from the tech companies is, well, that's really going to, have a negative impact on consumers. My understanding was the industries, multiple industries are in discussions to figure out a way so that there is not a financial or economic impact on the actual end user subscriber like you or I, but instead is an exchange of monies between companies. Can you give us a little more context as to how that would work?
Absolutely. And this is very important because in our digital economy today, we have B2B transactions and we have B2C transactions. And people don't realize that the B2B economy is an order of, 2 to 1 larger than B2C. So things like digital advertising, this is, many hundreds of billions of dollars a year, but this is not consumers paying to get advertising. You and I may do a Google search, but we don't give our credit card to Google to be able to do the search. Google will monetize our data. What do we click on? The keywords, but the bidding engine is going to be for advertisers on a set of keywords. So so one of the ideas is we need to create some kind of assessment on advertising. You could do cloud computing. Cloud computing is absolutely integrated in telecommunications, software as a service. In the old days, we used to send the disks through the mail or the hard disks. Today, you get your software through broadband. You can look at submarine cables. There's a whole set of B2B kinds of services which you can't pass on the cost to consumers. And that is a really important, something that the USF working group contemplated as they were looking at how to reform this. And that matters because it's a far more superior solution than, let's say, just making appropriations, because in appropriations, 2/3 of the people paying the taxes are the consumers. And the whole idea of the reform is let's take the burden off consumers because we want consumers to adopt broadband. We want to keep the price as low as possible, and we want to avoid them bearing the cost. And the cost should be borne by the financial beneficiaries. So, that's one part of it. The second part of it is what is the traffic? And that's like part 2 of the discussion. I can come back to that. But if you consider that 1/4 of all the traffic is advertising, consumers are not asking for advertising, but they're paying for advertising, whether they like it or not.
It's a very good point. And I don't want to transition away from USF yet, but I do think this is a good segue into the BEAD discussion. And that is, do you see any efforts out there beyond, people saying things from a podium that reflect an honest to goodness desire and plan to take a step back and assess exactly the state of this quote digital divide, given the multiple programs? So, USF has been out there, but we have had other infusion of government money into the system to support network build out. And what I'm not seeing is any sort of a true up by government entities or otherwise that is a realistic data-driven assessment as to exactly where we stand and where are the gaps. But again, you are much more tied in with some of the day-to-day work on this. Are you aware of any efforts in this regard? Roz?
Oh, well, so yes, I mean, one of the ideas is, I agree I absolutely see where your question's coming from. We want to know, what is it going to take to close the digital divide? The issue is that we haven't defined when are we done, because it's one thing to build out a location, but today the costs of operating the network in some cases are greater than building it.
Right.
And that is the issue with the traffic, because we have now sports streaming, Thursday night football, Monday night football. We have players who are not regulated like Amazon Prime and Netflix to get to stream sports. And the peaks that are experienced on the network are greater than what we experienced in COVID. These entities are not regulated by the FCC. They can send all the traffic they want. They pay zero to provision the network. And this is just a small fraction of people watching at any time. So the question is, what's in that basket of what is universal service? Is it enough to just build the connection? Because if I want to cover, the traffic's growing at 25% a year, that means every 3 to 4 years, you double the capacity of your network. Some networks could be faster than that, but that cost is not going away. And especially in rural areas where you don't have an increase in the number of consumers, you can't raise the price because of USF requirements. And also, even in cities, there's a lot of competition for broadband. So the operators are left holding the bag, where they have to be able to provision the network and they can't raise price on the end users, and they can't recover the cost from the traffic causers. So that is the challenge around how do we close the digital divide, because for many, video is part of the package, but do we say that entertainment, is it discretionary? Was video discretionary? So that is really a key component, which our statutory language has not dealt with. Right. And what I would say is, it really comes back to something I think Chairman Carr said very well yesterday at Free State Foundation. We have to have a real conversation about, the costs and benefits of broadband, who is participating, who is paying, what are the expectations? And that, I think, the silver lining of the USF case, if you will, is I think we have the chance to do that.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for those insights. And I do, Michael, wanted to move a little bit over to BEAD, which is not a USF issue. It is a standalone program that was created by the Biden administration. So I just wanted our attendees to recognize, USF, BEAD are two different programs. But what we're trying to do is do a create a holistic sense of how do we think subsidy programs in this space might fare going forward. So we know USF, part of the issue on the legality of how USF is structured and administered is currently being debated in front of the Supreme Court. Does not address the closing the digital divide piece. Michael, I think if you could share with us some of the research you have done in your new paper that was published, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, on the BEAD fund, which is the standalone, I would say, subsidy program primarily intended to push broadband deeper and further in the states of all different shapes. If you could maybe give a quick highlight of the program as created under the Biden administration, and then in light of all of the discussion under the new administration about needing to focus on the most pragmatic solution based on the geography and who we're trying to serve, kind of a slightly different take on the emphasis that should be used when dispersing these funds. You could just bring us up to speed in light of where things stand, and then if you could share with us some of the details from your own research on potential changes that could be made to BEAD that would make it more productive and more successful in its efforts.
Sure. So the loaded question. So I'll try to go.
I think I combined 4 questions for you.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll try to go step by step. So just quickly, and I'm sure everyone knows, BEAD was created as part of the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act of a few years ago. Congress gave $42 billion for broadband expansion, and in a pretty detailed statute told NTIA how it wanted to allocate these funds, essentially. NTIA was the coordinator, grants are going out through states. And so for the past 2-3 years during the Biden administration, the focus and the progress that was made was just all on the planning front. No money has gone out the door yet. And that's been a big issue, that no networks have been built with this money. So during the Biden administration, it was focused on planning, and what we've argued was in our paper and elsewhere that NTIA, even though it was more of a coordinator as envisioned by Congress, it really micromanaged the process by which states set up their grant programs. And so for 2 or 3 years, you had states drafting any number of different plans for how they plan to use and deploy these funds to close their digital divides, the ultimate goal being trying to get to or as close to 100% availability in states with their allocations. And then there's just a considerable back and forth between the states and NTIA over any number of different details regarding those programs. But we finally got to a point last year when NTIA had finally approved all those state plans, and states started the process of getting their grant programs off the ground. But of course, with the change in administration, there's been uncertainty now as to whether and how BEAD will progress in its current form or if it will be changed. But even so, states are continuing to move ahead with their grant programs because officially, even though there's been a number of different rumors and whispers about what might be happening in the Commerce Department or in Congress, officially, states have not been told to stop. So states are moving forward with their grant programs. 3 states so far have completed their program. 34 other states are in the process of accepting and reviewing applications. The other 13 states are working towards opening their application processes. And they're moving forward because they haven't been told to stop, and they also have deadlines they have to meet to submit their final proposals to NTIA.
Michael, can I just interrupt for one quick second? So the biggest change, at least in terms of headlines since the new administration has taken over, has been a change in focus, I believe, right? So whereas the BEAD program prior to 2025 seemed to be organized around a fiber first or a fiber focus or an emphasis on offers to build out fiber. But now it sounds as if really the focus is on whatever the right technology is to do it in the most pragmatic, fiscally responsible way. So it's no longer just about fiber. Am I correct that we hear comments out of Secretary Lutnick that in fact he's looking for awards to go to what actually is going to work. It doesn't necessarily mean not fiber, but it won't necessarily mean always fiber first. Is that a pretty good capture?
Right. So that's been part of the discussion for a while now. Ever since BEAD came out, some have said that it's just a fiber focused or only program. But the focus now, yeah, I mean, it has shifted, and there's been talk about making it more tech neutral or shifting funds to satellite services. Arguably, the program has always been about trying to find the most cost-effective means. You can get into the weeds as to the rules that the Biden administration put out it might have clouded it a little bit, but the focus has always been on trying to be as efficient and cost-effective as possible in finding the right technology for the job. I think NTIA under the Biden administration was explicit in that they were prioritizing fiber, and then non-priority projects were everything that wasn't fiber, and then satellite and fixed wireless. Certain kinds of fixed wireless were alternative platforms that were not quite as reliable as the other ones, but regardless of the nomenclature or however it was categorized by the previous administration, the statute that created BEAD was pretty clear as to how these funds are to be awarded, prioritizing. It didn't say fiber in the statute, but it said prioritizing awards to essentially the fastest technology out there. And so just on that, fiber will win pretty much. Will win every comparison between different platforms, but
no, we'll see we'll see what happens with 5G when it's fully realized, Michael. But
Mike,
go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to ask, in that, if the state, I mean, in my world, there's been many models that have been developed really around getting BEAD funding, and if that money hasn't yet flowed, but I guess the simplest question is, could that be at risk till these issues get debated?
The money going out the door, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, no money. So the 3 states that have already completed their process and are awaiting just the final stamp of approval in Louisiana, Delaware, and Nevada, they're ready to go. They're ready to hand out this money and get their networks built. But it's just one final. I think it's NIST has been holding up the process. And then several other states probably are ready to submit their final proposals to NTIA, but they're holding off because of this uncertainty as to if they do so, will they have to go back and maybe redo their grant programs, or reallocate their funds based on a different kind of framework in which they have to hand out money under a new set of rules, which could delay things even further.
Michael, can I ask you a question? Is there any congressional deadline in IIJA that directs when the money has to be dispersed?
Well, it all depends on when the various different proposals were approved and
Okay.
things like that. And once money is accepted, networks have to be built within a certain period of time. So it all kind of relates to each other. But
Okay.
Once a sub-grantee gets the money, then they have, I think it's 4 or 5 years within which to build their network.
Okay. Okay.
And things like that. So, but
We have successfully managed to avoid talking about your actual research and paper on how we might improve BEAD, and that I actually think it's a very clever piece of research, and I think a lot of folks would be interested in it because I think it very much takes that pragmatic view of what are the common sense things that we could probably strip away without changing the fundamental objective and ability of the program to accomplish something.
Right. And so I think the irony of all this is that there's been any complaints by folks like me and others in the administration elsewhere that no money has gone out the door. There's been all these delays, but here we are several months into the new administration, and we're still having these conversations about what needs to happen and when and by whom. In our paper that we put out a few weeks ago, we argued that, and this is, I think, pretty clear in the statute itself, the NTIA already has the authority to make pretty much all the changes that need to be made to streamline the program and get money out the door quickly. In the paper, and we've talked about Eswire and others have talked about, one of the big focus areas is just paring back a lot of the rules and requirements that were heaped on to the program under the Biden NTIA. I think there's pretty broad agreement among folks even who worked in the Biden NTIA that there were a number of rules that were just extraneous in nature and not reflected in the statute at all. So our paper recommends NTIA just simply in a guidance document, saying that some of these rules around labor requirements and wage requirements and climate resiliency and things like that are just pared back or removed entirely. At the same time, also through NTIA, making clear that any type of action by a state in its BEAD program that's tantamount to rate regulation is prohibited. And again, there's been a good amount of agreement that the efforts within BEAD to set prices for certain types of offerings made over these networks is rate regulation. And NTIA under the Biden administration was very, we've argued and used the word coercive towards the states in making sure that they set a price for certain types of low-cost offerings. Some states pushed back, but NTIA held off on approving their plans until they gave in. And but the alternative could be that states just accept proposals from sub-grantees for people looking for BEAD funds, proposals as to what an affordable price might be for certain offerings, and then having the applicants justify those prices rather than the state on its own setting those prices. And then the other big issue that we address in our paper focuses on what we were just talking about, around trying to provide some more clarity around the role of satellite service in the program. The paper talks about having NTIA provide more clarity around the threshold or the high cost threshold that's set by states that essentially gives them a cutoff after which they can start looking at other platforms for serving areas with BEAD funds. States were given wide latitude to set their own thresholds based on their allocations and their geographies and things like that. But then that has kind of fed into the dialogue around some states theoretically giving subsidies for fiber that are tens of thousands of dollars per location, when you could serve those same locations with satellite or fixed wireless at a much lower cost. So we've argued that in the paper that NTIA should use some of the data put out by reputable firms like Cartesian or others that have really crunched these numbers and try to set a clearer and maybe a lower threshold for that cutoff between fiber and other technologies. In the paper, I think we said $9,000 or $10,000 a location.
Versus 60 to 100.
Right, and that could get you lower costs, more efficiency. But it's also worth looking at. So we've had a couple of states, like I said, already complete their grant process, and if you look at Louisiana and Nevada, for example, I think those are two states to look at and see how. Not that they'll show how it'll play out in other states, but Louisiana was able to fund 95% of its, or allocate 95% of its BEAD funds for fiber. 3% will go to fixed wireless, 2% or so will go to satellite. And they were very confident going in that they had more than enough money more than enough BEAD funds to reach universal availability. And then they even have extra left over that they use for several demand side projects. But Nevada is interesting because they went into the grant process not very confident that they'd have enough money to reach 100% availability, but they were able to do so by giving, I think it's about 80% of their funds to fiber, and the rest split almost evenly between fixed wireless and satellite. So I think those kind of give you a high level look at how this might play out in other states under the current rules, or even under some of the streamlined rules that we propose in our paper. Fiber probably has a case to make in the vast majority of locations. Fixed wireless, second, and then satellite as a niche provider,
Right.
closing the gaps in the really extremely remote and high cost areas.
Right.
But I think any effort to kind of artificially change that framework based on the needs and desires of certain companies would really throw a wrench in things and could really create havoc at the state level and create any number of potentially awkward political conversations between states and the federal government.
Awkward and political is what we do these days. Come on, Ben.
One of the other things would be that was the red tape associated with this. Love it or hate it, we seem to be with an administration is a large sucking sound to get the red tape away. How do you see that all settling out? Letter of credits, things like that. It just seemed very hard to get people to get the money into the hands of players. Is that going to be easier?
I hope so. I mean, it remains to be seen. We hear, the Commerce Secretary said that there's a thorough review ongoing for BEAD, and there's DOGE, and then Congress has weighed in too with some proposals, but there's not been, at least to my knowledge, I'm outside the Beltway up here in New York, so I don't know, but it doesn't seem like there's been much of a much more progress beyond just those proposals. I'm not sure what could come out of all this and when. I'm not in the Signal chat on that, so I don't know, but
and also there's a hearing. It's today, Wednesday, tomorrow, for the woman who has been nominated to run NTIA. So I would imagine once Ms. Roth, Ariel Roth, is in place, that perhaps some of the timing and the outcome of the taking another look at the program, we might see some more concrete action.
Right.
But, really quick, Roz, I wanted to circle back with you. Certainly I understand the equities, I understand the policy consideration, but let me ask you this. If the base for USF support was in fact expanded to include, as you put it, I'll call it tech companies, but it's really the beneficiaries of having access. What does that look like for them? So right now, I think they just raised the USF assessment on voice to about 36 and maybe 37 cents, which is ridiculous. I know that's not necessarily how it would work, but what are we looking at in terms of financial impact for the tech guys? Is it even a rounding error for them if they were
Yeah,
contributing?
well, I mean, I think if you look at, the data that I've used comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which did a great series of reports on digital economy, and that looked at the specific services like the SaaS and cloud computing and so on. This sector has grown 700% the last decade. And it is growing because companies are investing in AI. So the interesting thing is you have a very positive effect in the sense that if you assess, let's say you assess some set of 3 or 4 large tech providers, that you could start at less than 1%, let's say 0.08, and each year you would lower that percentage because the revenue of those services grows faster than the rate of assessment. So this is, just to put it another way, the reason why you don't want to assess broadband, the broadband market, let's say 300, let's say there's a set of monies, the broadband market is essentially flat, right? You don't have really high, the price of broadband for consumers is flat or declining. So, there's one proposal to assess it at 4%. But if the market only grows at 1% or
Right.
0, you are attacking the underlying revenue. If, however, you assess a market that is growing up, logarithmically, linearly, what have you, the assessment is declining over time.
Right.
So,
Right.
that is the beauty of doing that model. Now, I would suggest there's a lot more controls that you could put in place. You could put kind of triggers on how much to assess. You could have the FCC do more of the work. A lot of the USAC function could be brought in-house to the FCC. Some of it could be automated. I even describe an ex post method. You could even devise a method to say, let's say with Affordable Connectivity Program, hello, Meta, we brought you 1 million users last year.
Right.
And by the way, every new user to you is worth this amount per year. I know that you're willing to spend 1 month's revenue up front to get that user because of the revenues you earn on the advertising over the year. You should reimburse the Treasury XYZ. So there's a variety of ways to do it. And let me even take one step back, for my market-minded friends on this call, that we're even talking about subsidies in this way. I mean, the GAO pointed out 100 subsidy programs across 15 agencies. I mean, nobody can stay on top of this. And that I would just submit here, the reason that we're even dealing with this is that we have lost the forest for the trees. We forgot that broadband is a two-sided market, and that essentially the beneficiaries who should be participating in the actual cost of building the networks, they are not. They are not participating in the actual last mile and the cost of the spectrum. They have only their hosting centers. They have their own plant, but they are not involved in the real work of broadband. And that is why we have a market failure, that we need the federal government and the states to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to correct for that. And if we went back to first principles of two-sided market, this would be a very different story.
Right. No, absolutely agree. And I know I brought it up at the top of the call, but this idea that we still don't have a true up of exactly what's happening. And I understand the FCC has its maps, et cetera, but we always know that there's a data gap there, not for any nefarious reason at the FCC, but in terms of how they collect it, when it's collected versus when the report goes out. We are pulling up a little bit close to our end of the discussion. And let me just see if I have this right. So in terms of USF, we have 2 things going on. One, how do we, and this was a conversation prior to the Supreme Court oral argument today, and that is, how do we have a program, if we're going to subsidize build out in areas where there is a market failure, i.e. private companies can't or won't be there, then if we're going to have a subsidy program to get them there, needs to be narrowly tailored, and we have to spread the cost of that over the maximum entities possible. Unclear what that's going to look like, even if the USF decision goes down the road of this is constitutional, obviously we still are left with, okay, then how do we fix the program? If it's not constitutional, then, it's a whole nother set of conversations. And then meantime, Michael, we've got BEAD, it's being looked at. Maybe it will be, I know if they follow your suggestions, we'll scrape away some of the lard that was piled on after the legislation was put in place. And perhaps to your point, Jen, especially for some of the smaller companies, maybe this money finally does hit the market and it actually ends up flowing faster than it might have otherwise, even though it's been kind of delayed so far.
Yes.
Is that, am I pulling this together, Michael,
Can
Roz?
I just want to
Yes,
say,
please.
I'm not, even though I know that the systems and technology exist that you could assess every single enterprise in the
Mhm.
digital economy for USF, I suggest that you just look at the salient entities, the ones that are accounting for the majority of the revenue. And you
Right.
can look at that by the percentage of traffic, you can look at that by the number of users, you can look at that by the so that you can set up a set of thresholds.
Sure.
And I think that that's relevant because you have a declining economies of scale and going after, Joe's my favorite website or what have you, versus the platforms where they are the hyperscalers, where they have the significant revenues and investment to make this
Mhm.
worthwhile. And
Jen, how
I
do you
would
think the
say,
go ahead, Roz, sorry.
no, I was going to say, this is something that's contemplated in other countries as well,
Sure.
that you need to have you're going to have a set of graduated thresholds, which are rational and supportable, and that's transparent for the marketplace as well. And that's
Mhm.
essentially would correct the market failure we have today.
Jen, how do you think the hyperscalers would feel about being pulled into the USF contribution discussion?
Good question. I don't really have a good answer. I don't know how I mean, it's so outside their core view, but I mean, they seem to be leaning aggressively into our world. So it might be
Mhm.
just the way to get here even further.
Well, maybe that will be a good part of a conversation for one of our nuggets later in the
That's
later in the
right.
spring.
Definitely.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again, both to you, Roz, and to you, Michael, for making time to join us today. I don't think the topics could be more timely, not just with what's happening inside the Beltway with the new administration, but what's happening in the courts. Jen, as always, it was fantastic to see you. I don't know that we have picked our date yet for our April Nuggets.
No.
I'm guessing maybe it might touch on Spectrum. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff going on inside the Beltway on that. But in the meantime, again, thank you both, Roz and Michael, for joining us. We will send around, and in case you missed it, with links to your research for anyone who might not have already seen it. And Jen, I think over to you for any last thoughts and comments.
No, thank you both. This is definitely timely in Wall Street circles, and I guess all eyes on June, right? When we're expected to hear from the courts. So stay tuned. Great.
Absolutely.
Thank
Everyone, see
you
you
all.
soon.
Thank you.
Thank you again.